Hello and welcome to October's FAS TV update. My name is Hannah Orr and I'm bringing you the vet update this month from the Craveston Vet Labs. I work for SRUC Vet Services here in Aberdeen and I'm regularly in the post-mortem room investigating the cause of disease in livestock submitted by farmers to discover why they're having losses in their flocks and herds. These diagnoses are fed into an anonymised database so that Scottish Government knows what's happening with diseases across Scotland, and they get informed through the work that we do of any new and emerging diseases too. Of course, we use that gathered information as well in many ways, including to inform farmers like yourselves of what we're seeing locally and nationally in the flocks and herds across Scotland. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank those of you who participate and contribute by submitting samples and cases. You're helping others as well as gaining valuable information for yourselves and your livestock. The end of October has seen some very wet and challenging conditions across Scotland, with flooding in many areas, particularly on the east side of the country. Tragically, 3 people lost their lives in the recent floods, and there was also impact on producers who lost both crops and livestock. There are a variety of livestock jobs being done on farms at this time of year. The tupping and bulling seasons are well underway. More cattle are now coming in to prevent further damage to the soil and grass in this wet time of year. Beef cows and calves will recently have been weaned or are just about to be. And with stock now inside, folk are busy each day feeding and cleaning. But what are we seeing in the post-mortem room? Parasitic diseases dominated the diagnoses made in Aberdeen in September and October, with lungworm and gutworms causing problems in cattle and gutworms causing ill thrift in sheep. If your animals are scouring or ill-thriven, whilst gutworms are one of the major culprits and one of the most likely causes, there are other possibilities. In the last few months we've seen rumen acidosis, intestinal torsion and bloat as causes in cattle, and with ill thrift in sheep we've seen Johne's disease and OPA causing that. Tick-borne diseases have also been a feature, with louping ill and tick-borne fever causing problems in animals as well. In an earlier episode of FAS TV, my colleague Helen mentioned that lungworm cases hadn't really been seen much this year, but that's now all changed, with cases of lungworm being diagnosed in all areas across Scotland in the last month. The timing's a bit later this year, possibly because of the unusual weather patterns that we've had, with hot, dry weather early on in June, followed later by warm and wet weather. A recent publication that you can access online estimated the total cost of this disease in the UK to be about £14.4 million, and the cost for individual animals between £50 and £100. In dairy cattle, some of this loss is through the milk drop that's experienced, but the disease can also cause mortalities too. So it's important to look out for coughing cattle still at grass or in recently housed animals, particularly in younger stock in their first grazing seasons. Additional signs to be aware of would be loss of condition, increased frequency of breathing or difficulty breathing, and all these signs together have earned the disease the name HUSC. The testing that is available for HUSC through SRUC Vet Services includes post-mortem examination, which reveals the lungs themselves. We can see, that reveals the lungworms in the airways. We can see them with the naked eye. There's also something called the Bayerman technique, which we can do on cattle or sheep feces, but in this case it's just cattle we'd be doing it on, to look for lungworm larvae. And there's also an antibody test on blood. Whilst lungworm is most often seen in younger animals, it can also occur in adult animals too. It's harder to diagnose in this age category of animal because the disease isn't patent. That means that the adult worms aren't passing any eggs, and so we're not able to look at cattle feces in order to detect the lungworm larvae. The disease in adults may present a little bit differently too to the coughing that you usually see in the younger stock. If cattle that have previously had lungworm are exposed to high numbers of larvae, they can get a hypersensitivity reaction in their airways, and as a result you may see fast developing illness and even mortality without any respiratory signs. We recently had a case in the Aberdeen PM room of husk reinfection syndrome, as you call it, in a 20-month-old bull, and it had caused the death of that animal. If you think you're seeing signs of lungworm in your cattle, speak to your vet for further information on prevention and treatment. They can advise you on any testing needed as well. Gut parasites have also been active in sheep, causing ell-thrift and deaths. In Aberdeen, we've seen one notably late nematodes case in a farm in the last few weeks, which again is unusual timing. We wonder if the explanation is that the spring hatch on pasture was late this year, and then in conjunction with the unusual weather that we had, where it was very hot and dry, and then later on it was wet, it meant that just some of the age groups of lamb weren't exposed to the hatch parasite earlier on in the year, and they didn't develop immunity as a result. So now they're being exposed to high numbers of nematodes on pasture, and they're experiencing nematodes disease now. In the farmer in the most recent case, they hadn't had any deaths. They were reporting stary coats and poor body condition. And a really top tip is illustrated here for ensuring you get a representative sample from your animals when collecting faeces for a worm egg count. The farmer in this case was sitting in his pickup watching his animals. He knew they were ill and he knew he needed a fecal sample, so he was watching out for the animals that were poorly and scouring to pass muck. He then targeted those animals to pick up their faeces off the pasture. That meant that when he was collecting those faeces for that worm egg examination, he was collecting samples from representative animals that had the disease. So the important point to remember is if you were collecting faeces off pasture for a worm egg examination, we're aware that there's a risk of preferentially collecting formed faeces from animals because those are the ones that are naturally easier to pick up. Whereas the more liquid or less formed faeces from animals that are poorly, that's harder to pick up off the ground. So bear in mind when you are collecting a sample of the animals you're aiming to sample from. And if there are animals with signs of gut disease, such as scour, then do your best to collect samples from those representative animals. The recommended method is to collect 10 representative samples and submit them without pooling so that the lab can take a measured sample from each one and create a pool that equally represents each animal that you took faeces from. And lastly, a fluke update. Livestock farmers would traditionally be expecting this time of year to be peak fluke season. But as we've already mentioned, this is a really unusual year in terms of weather patterns. So far this autumn, we haven't seen any recently acquired fluke infections in sheep coming through the post-mortem room in Aberdeen, St Boswells, Dumfries and Glasgow. Whilst there seems to have been a low liver fluke challenge in the year so far, if temperatures do remain above 10 degrees C, fluke risk will increase this season. So you're most likely to know already whether you have fluke risk on your farm, even down to the riskiest fields, but keep an eye out for this disease later in the season if the weather stays warm. Again, if you're not sure and you want to discuss fluke risks further with your vet, then speak to them about prevention and treatment. Tests available through SRUC Vet Services for fluke include post-mortem examinations, so we can take a look at the liver, examination of the faeces for fluke eggs, and note, this can be undertaken on the same sample that you've put in for a pooled or an individual worm egg count. There's a blood antibody test for fluke that's available, or a fluke coproantigen test. This we do on the faeces of animals, but amazingly it can pick up the liver fluke digestive enzymes. For more fluke forecast information, check out SRUC's podcast. Another of our vets, Helen Stevenson, has recently recorded this on the topic of the autumn 2023 liver fluke risk. You can search online for SRUC podcasts. It's available through many of the popular podcast providers, but it's also available on the SRUC website. If you go there, follow the links from news and events through to podcasts and videos, and you'll find it there. Two other useful sources of information on worms and fluke and so on are the COWS and SCOPS group. COWS stands for Control of Worms Sustainably, and SCOPS stands for Sustainable Control of Parasites in Sheep. These groups have also recently released further information on the current liver fluke forecast for this season, and this can be found online by searching using the terms cows or scops. So that's all for this month. Tune in next time for an update on what our vets have been seeing in livestock across the country at the end of autumn. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.